Okay, well, thank you very much. Welcome along. This is wonderful, isn't it? It's a beautiful venue, an amazing venue, beautiful town, and the sun is shining as well. So it's not a bad way to start on Monday morning, really, is it? So what I'm going to talk to you about is what works, I suppose, from my perspective. And I'm just going to give you an overview of what I'll look at. And so we'll look at a little bit of background, a little bit about myself, but also a little bit about you. And I'll get you involved in that as well. We'll look at the 7 secrets, and the secrets of successful doctoral students. What do they seem to do, or what might they do? We'll look at, from the perspective of supervisors, what they might do to be more successful in strategies. I'll talk about some of the changes that I've seen happen over the last probably 20 years from my perspective and how that impacts on people. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a little challenge, or a little something that I think you should be doing, or that's one of my sort of pet topics, and get you to think about that. So we'll start off with a bit of background. So a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Hugh Kearns. I live in Adelaide, down there at the bottom of Australia. I work at a university called Flinders University. And my area of interest and research is the idea of self-management. How do you manage yourself? And I'm particularly interested in why people don't manage themselves. That's things like procrastination, overcommitment, distraction, perfectionism. All those things the PhD students are really, really good at. So they tend to be the subjects in my research. And I'll explain how I got into it, because for many years I used to run the staff development and training unit at my university. And people like you would come along to workshops on things like time management, and write everything down, and they would say it was a great course, and then they would go away, and I'd meet them a few weeks later, and they hadn't done any of the things we talked about. So that used to frustrate me, but then I got really interested in the idea of why don't people do what they say they would like to do. They'd say they'd like to write a paper, but they don't do it. They'd say they'd like to leave at 5 o'clock, but they don't do it. They know what they want to do, but they don't do it. So to understand that, I decided to go and do research in psychology. But as part of the research, I needed participants. But they had to be very special people. They had to be good at procrastination, good at getting distracted. They had to overcommit themselves, and they had to be perfectionistic. So I searched hard around my university to find people like that. And who do you think I found? Doctoral candidates. Because here was a group who had one clear target, work on your research. But yet they would spend years doing other things. But not only that, because they were really clever, they would have really good reasons why they had to do all this other stuff. It all sounded very plausible, but they still weren't doing what they said they wanted to do. So myself and my colleague, we did some research with them, we ran workshops, and we measured it and published it, and we were able to change those behaviours. And then we found it wasn't just at Flinders that people procrastinated and got distracted. It seemed to happen at other universities as well. So now I spend about half a day a week at my university, and most of my time is travelling around to other universities around Australia or around the world, working with researchers, research students, research supervisors about how they might be a little bit more effective at what they might do. Now, if you've listened carefully so far, you'll think that doesn't sound like a very Australian accent. And that's right, because I'm from a place called Sligo, which is over there on the west coast of Ireland. But I've spent the last 30 years in Australia trying to develop an Australian accent. Without much success at this stage, so we'll just keep on going. But as I said, most of my time is running a business called Thinkwell, and running workshops like this at universities all around the world. And if you want to find out more, there's a website, there's materials there. And as Ken was saying, my research, I suppose, is working with research students, researchers, and writing a series of books and materials all around those areas, and you can find more information on the web. So that's a bit about me. I'm going to get you to tell me who you are in a moment as well. But first of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit, I suppose, a description of the PhD process. And there's lots of different images and metaphors, running a marathon or climbing a mountain. But the image I like the best is this idea of the roller coaster, the ups and downs of the journey. And we had this image created. I'm just going to describe the different parts. So this person here is right at the very start of a PhD, the first few weeks or first month or so. And if you look closely at that picture, you'll note that he's still smiling at that stage. Because when people start a PhD, it's a mixture of excitement, I've been accepted in, this is going to be wonderful, I'm going to change the world, win the Nobel Prize. But also anxiety, because most people when they start a PhD have no idea what they're undertaking. All they know is, I've got 3 or 4 years to do this thing, have to find something new and original, have to produce a thesis at the end of it. But the other thing they all hear is, I've got a supervisor. And naturally enough, when they hear the word supervisor, they think somebody's going to supervise. And what they imagine is that on the first day there'll be somebody out there at the front gate of the university who will take them by the hand and say, come along, sit down, I'm going to tell you how it's all going to work out. Because the word supervisor implies that. Well, very quickly people enter this phase. That was when they turn up at the front gate and there wasn't anyone out there to meet them. And when they finally do track down their supervisor and have the first meeting and they think, right, now we're going to get started, suddenly they realize not only do they not know the answer to the question, they don't even know what the question is. And neither does the supervisor. And the supervisor will probably say something like, why don't you go off and do some reading and work out what the question is? And very quickly they begin to realize this would be very different from anything they've had to do before. Because their previous education is fairly structured, timetables, curriculums. When they get to a PhD, we say, well, you're a big person now. Work it out for yourself. Work out what you want to do, when you want to do it. And one of the nice things about doing research in a PhD is the flexibility. They have a lot of time and control. But after a little while, one of the terrible things about doing a PhD is the flexibility. Because they begin to wonder, am I doing the right thing? I don't really know. Am I working hard enough? My supervisors say go off and read, but the more I read, the more confused I seem to get. And the other problem they have is when they join a PhD program, they tend to assume, and certainly their family and friends tend to assume, that their IQ should go up by 10 points straight away. You're supposed to be clever now. So that means they can't go around asking stupid questions. And in my experience, a lot of students waste the first 3 or 4 months of their PhD. Because they have no idea what they're doing, they don't want to ask questions, look stupid, and so they wander around aimlessly wasting time. And that can lead to some students dropping off the roller coaster, that person there. I have a little phrase that says, PhD students never die, they just fade away. And by that I mean they don't ring up on Monday and say, like, I'm pulling out. It'll be much more gradual than that. What happens is they stop turning up for meetings, they stop replying to emails, they take a little break for a while, they go part-time, and gently fade off the system. So they're not gone, but not actively engaged anymore. If they get to that, this person here in the yellow car is in the middle part of a PhD. And then that phase even has a name in the literature. That's called the mid-thesis doldrums, or the mid-thesis blues. Because what happens is they're over the early shock and they're off doing things. But one of the problems of research is a lot of the early work you do is to prove what doesn't work. You go do some reading and you realize someone's already done it, you have to modify your question, you try and do some experiments, they may not work. And it's still a long way to the end, and they begin to wonder, will I ever get there, will I get results? And they can be very disillusioned in that middle part. And often it's other people getting in the way. If participants don't respond, supervisors don't do their bit, lots of things get in the way. And if they get to that, this person here in the yellow jumper is in their final year of their PhD. And if you look closely at him, you'll notice there'll be either tears or sweat at that point. And that's hopefully when the student comes to realize this thesis is not going to write itself. You've got to come in every day and push it up the hill. And the other problem he has is he doesn't know if that really is the end. Because maybe you get to here and maybe there'll be more ups and downs. Because the question is, how would you know when a PhD is finished? And the answer is, a PhD is never finished. There's always more, another chapter, another reference could keep on going. And that's one of the big jobs of a supervisor, is to say, that's enough now, stop, you can hand it in at that point. So that's the roller coaster. So in a moment, I'm going to get you now just there's the different stages as you go through. And I'm going to get you to just say hello to the people around you and tell them your name, what you do here. But in particular, think back to your own roller coaster. What were the highs and lows of that process? So say hello to 1 or 2 people around you and tell them where the highs and lows were in the roller coaster. Here you go. and said this wasn't a very good picture for a PhD, and I was asking why. And she said, well, in this roller coaster, there was only one down period. And another student said that they wanted a roller coaster for every day of their PhD. Because it really is a bit of an emotional journey, you know, like they find a new article, this is going to be wonderful, and then they read it and they realise it contradicts everything they've said, or they're getting ready for a meeting with their supervisor and think they're going well, and the supervisor says, sorry, back 4 steps, and so all the ups and downs of the journey. And I think this metaphor is really important for students and for supervisors, everyone involved, is we tend to focus on the academic work and the research, but the actual emotional part of it is probably more important than the whole lot. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about as we go through. I'll come back to the roller coaster in a moment, but I'm just going to talk about the 7 secrets of what I've found to be, I suppose, effective or successful research students, and I'll run through them briefly. And so the first of the 7 secrets is called the care and maintenance of your supervisor. And this is the first one because it is by far and away the most important. When you look at predictors of people finishing and finishing on time, the thing that stands out most of all is good supervision. They get good supervision, you know, they get there broadly on time, and they might still be smiling by the time they get there. If they get poor supervision, it'll take a lot longer, they might not get there at all, and they definitely won't be smiling, they'll be just glad to get out. So supervision. And you'll notice the way I said it says the care and maintenance of your supervisor. And that's the idea that they have to do it. And I think the word supervisor is not very helpful. And in the US they don't have supervisors, they have advisors. We wrote this article a while ago, the care and maintenance of your advisor. And mentor, and I think they're probably much more helpful words, because when the student hears supervisor, they naturally, this is a word we've borrowed from industry or business, and it has a particular meaning, somebody who's going to sort of run the show. But in supervisors I work with, never see themselves in that role. They see it's your thesis, I'm here to provide support, but you have to get on and do it. So the word supervisor itself, I think, is a little bit of a problem. And this is really hard for students to get over this idea, because their previous education, you know, they were consumers, that sort of people gave it to them. Now they have to run the show. And that's really hard. When you turn up as a new student and you've got a senior professor on the other side, it's really hard to think, I'm supposed to tell them how this is going to work. But that's what the supervisor's thinking, you tell me. And so a lot of problems arise. And so that's, I suppose I talk to students, I work with thousands of students every year, and I've had a look at their to-do list. And the typical to-do list of a student is, you know, check your emails, check your Facebook profile, and then somewhere high up on the list is their thesis. And then they make the assumption is, because it's important to me, it must be really important to my supervisor as well. And they don't realise that they're not on the supervisor's A list or B list, they're down the bottom of their C list. And that isn't because the supervisor doesn't like them, it's because supervisors are really, really busy. And when the supervisor doesn't hear from the student, they're not, what's their working assumption? Everything's fine. They're not thinking, I'm a bit bored today, I think I'll ring up a student. And so this leads to a lot of problems, because the students there thinking they're going to come and get me, and the supervisor's thinking, oh, you come and see me. And so I think one of the strategies I strongly urge for students is the idea of organising meetings. And structured meetings with things like agendas. And again, it doesn't have to be very formal, but that idea of regularity, meetings, touching base and whatever. And again, explain to students that it's your job to do these things. Because they're thinking, well, the supervisor will tell me, and it's getting them into the idea that they have to take a lot more ownership and control of it. So that's the first of the secrets. The second secret is writing. And it says, write and show as you go. This is show and tell, not hide and seek. And a lot of students are playing hide and seek with their supervisors. Because you'll all have heard the phrase, you know, make sure your students write early. So you say to your student, you are writing, aren't you? And the student says, oh yes I am. Could I see a little bit? Oh no, it's not quite ready yet. Just a little bit more polishing. And students have learned a whole lot of techniques to put the supervisor off the scent and so forth. And so getting them writing early is important, but our research team at Flinders, we've discovered one of the real reasons why students don't write, and I call it a writer's disease. And the disease is called readitis. And that's the belief that reading one more article will solve all the research problems, and then they'll feel ready to write. And that's what happens, because at the beginning they have to read all these things, and so they get consumed with the literature. And this problem is much worse for students now than it probably was when you were going through. Because 20 years ago, it took a while for stuff to get disseminated. Now, if somebody publishes an article in Australia today, it's on your desk when you go back this afternoon. But also what's happened is the volume of literature has just exploded. And so the idea that they're going to read all the stuff is just no longer valid. But what they do is spend months and months, if not years, consumed in the literature. And of course you do have to read. There's as well as reading, they need to be writing. And so it's doing those things at the same time. The third secret I talk about is be realistic. It's not a Nobel Prize. Because when most students start, they hear those magic words. You have to add something new and original to the body of knowledge. And when they hear those words, that's when the thought bubbles happen, and they see themselves up there on the stage with Einstein and Mother Teresa and Bob Dylan and all these people, because that's what they're thinking. I have to solve all these great problems. Most students, when they start a PhD, want to do about 2 or 3 PhDs. You know, they want to solve all the great problems in the world. And one of the big jobs of a supervisor is to narrow that down and explain this is what you can actually achieve within this time frame. So they're not very good at sort of scaling what needs to be done. But the second problem for most PhD students I work with is they're really bad at judging the quality of their own work and where they fit themselves. And I would say about 95, maybe even more, of students that I work with experience this psychological construct called the imposter syndrome. And the imposter syndrome is the belief or the feeling that you are just one step away from being exposed as a complete fraud. And when the supervisor says to the student, I think we should have a chat, what the student is thinking, they're going to kick me out. They've worked out that I can't do this thing and so forth. And it's very, very common among PhD students, probably among researchers and research supporters. I can tell you standing up here, it's a strong feeling of the imposter syndrome, as who am I to be talking about this. But it's very, very common among a PhD, and it stops people doing lots of things because you're worried you're going to be found out. And so that's the idea of being realistic. The fourth of the secret says, say no to distractions. Even the fun ones and the ones you think you have to do. And again, Newton had a bit to say about distractions. He said, for each and every action towards completing your research, there is an equal and opposite distraction. And I think he was wrong, because I think there are overwhelming and opposite distractions that would rather what you do. And when I was doing a thesis at Adelaide a long time ago, I was working full-time, and I was supposed to be doing my literature in the evening when I came home. And my partner couldn't understand how helpful I was around the house during that thesis. And will I say, will I do the washing up for you? Will I do the laundry? Will I mow the lawn again? I mowed it a couple of days ago, but it might have grown overnight. And we had the neatest garden in the street during that thesis. And then when the thesis was over, I stopped being so helpful around the house anymore. So the question is, when your student is supposed to be working on the research, why is housework so much fun? And the reason it's fun, psychology tells us, is because when I come home at the end of the day, I'm supposed to be working on the thesis, and I didn't want to do that. But if I'd sat down and watched television, I would have felt guilty. So you have to come up with good, plausible excuses, worthy causes, you know, helping your kids with their homework. Even if they don't want help with their homework, it's they're helping them. And in psychology, these are what are called displacement activities. And what they're doing is displacing the guilt you feel for what you should be doing. And because your students are very clever, they come up with really high quality displacement activities, really worthy causes. And so teaching, tutoring, marketing, grants and other projects, EndNote and formatting are wonderful displacement activities. You know, you can spend hours and hours making sure the styles in your document are really good, but not actually doing the work itself. And so again, I suppose it's being aware of, and nowadays, so to be fair to your students, there are just so many distractions with technology and the internet. There's so many things, and sometimes I ask people, you know, what did we do to distract ourselves before the internet? You know, we must have found ways, but everybody now has email, all that. You know, we did before, but now it's so in your face all the time. There are so many distractions out there for students. Secret number 5 says it's a job, which means working 9 to 5, but they get holidays. I don't literally mean 9 to 5, but it's some sort of regularity. And this one is really important, because I can usually spot a PhD student about 20 yards away. And the way you can recognise a PhD student is they always carry a big black cloud of guilt wherever they go. They're always guilty. When they're working on the research, they're thinking, I should be doing some writing. When they're doing writing, I should be spending time with my family. When they're with their family, I should be back in the lab. Constantly sense of guilt all the time. And the reason they're guilty is because they don't know how much they should be doing. And so that's why the strategy there, I think, is treated like a job, which means regularity, routine. This is what you're supposed to do. Because then you can have time off and you can have holidays in other parts. And I know a student in Australia, and she tells her, when people ask her what she does, she said she never tells people she's a student. She says, I'm a researcher. And if you're a funded researcher, you are a researcher, because once you're a student, the assumption is, oh, well, just wander around and sort of have lots of chats and whatever. But it actually is their job. And the benefit is that it makes you feel better, you can have time off and move it. Now, it can be a nice job, but treating it like a job. Secret number 6 says, get help. You are not an owner-operated, single-person business. And again, what I found with clever, high-performing people is they think, I should be able to do it all by myself. And I tell students, no, what clever people do is get as much help as they can. And I'm sure many of you in graduate schools, you offer lots of support, lots of help, but often people don't take it up. And then the crisis happens, they say, why didn't you come and see us? And they go, oh, I'm supposed to do it by myself. And so it's encouraging them that help is okay. That is not a sign of weakness, it's actually a sensible thing to do to get help. And then the last of the secrets is, you can do it. A PhD is 90% persistence and 10% intelligence. And I often work with students and they'll say, oh, am I clever enough to do a PhD? And I always tell them that's the wrong question. The real question is, are you persistent enough to do a PhD? That means when your experiments don't work, will you get up tomorrow and have another go? Or when your supervisor shreds your work, will you make the change and put it back again? You have to be clever, but more importantly, you have to be persistent. You have to actually get there to the end of that whole process. So there are 7 secrets, and again, there's probably lots of many other things as well, but I've found working with thousands of students all around the world, and these apply no matter what country in the US, Australia, or here, these ideas about if you did these, it would make the process a lot more manageable, a lot more successful along the way. So that's for the students. So now I'm going to turn to the supervisors, and just talk a bit about some of them. And I joined Twitter a while ago, and so one of the tweets that, probably one of the most popular tweets and was retweeted lots of times, was this one, and it was about supervision. And it says, there are 2 parts to research supervision. First of all, developing the research, and secondly, developing the researcher. And it's really easy to forget that second one, because we're so focused on getting the results, getting the things like that. And I remember getting a response to that, one of those tweets, and it said, do we really need to tell people this? And yes, we do. Because there are many supervisors who will say, that's not my job. My job is to get the research done. You develop yourself along the way. And I would argue, successful supervisors I would want and encourage is ones who see it as both of the jobs. The research is important, but also the person, and how to research them, their personal development, their skills, what happens after the whole process. So the 2 parts, the researcher as well as the research. So some strategies that I think I've seen as being successful in terms of supervisors. The first one is about selection. And after I run workshops, I'll often have people come up to me and say, look, I have this problem with this student, what do I do about it? And my answer always is, the best way to deal with problems is not have problems. Because once you've got them, it's usually going to be tricky or hard. And what that means is being a lot more careful about who gets onto the roller coaster in the first place. And that's being a little bit careful about who gets into the program. And nowadays that's hard because there's so much pressure on universities and students or supervisors to take on more students. We need more and more, which means often people aren't very careful about who they let in. And especially for new supervisors, because they're keen to get somebody, and so they often take inappropriate or just badly matched students. And so I would say, I'll meet very senior supervisors, and they will say to me, it is better to have no student than a difficult student. I know supervisors who will have turned down grant money because they'll say, I'll end up doing the work myself if I can't find a good student or the right student. And so being a little bit more selective. And this is not to discriminate against students, it's good for the student as well. And so the match works well. The second thing is often supervisors will say to me, what style should I have? And I will say you don't need one style, you need lots of styles. Because, of course, the relationship changes over the 3 or 4 years. At the beginning, essentially the supervisor has all the power. They know more about the topic, more of the area. But over the next 3 or 4 years, that's going to change a lot. And that means the supervisor's style needs to change as well, which means probably more supportive at the beginning and then a little bit more encouraging independence a bit later on. But some supervisors don't change styles, they keep the same one all the way through. The next couple of things about supervisors, there was a nice study done at James Cook University by the dean up there, and she was looking at what she was calling overstayers, or students who were taking longer to finish, and she was looking at some things that correlated with that, and she found 2, and they matched with my experience as well. And the first one was about meetings. And she found fairly consistently that whenever there were problems, and students were having problems, you began to look and they weren't meeting with the supervisor, weren't very effective, and things were going wrong. Now meetings don't fix everything, but they allow you to pick up problems much earlier on and keep things on track. And so meetings with structures and agendas, I think, are really, really important, and I talk a lot about that. And the second one that she found was feedback. And she found either students weren't getting feedback, they were waiting for months and months to get feedback, or when they got it, it wasn't very helpful. Or worse, it was actually demoralizing, and they were losing their confidence and not going through the whole process. And again, I think feedback needs to be a bit of a continuum. It starts off positive and then builds into more critical as time goes by. The other crucial thing about feedback is when we think about feedback, we think about the supervisor giving feedback to the student. And feedback needs to be a two-way process. It means the supervisor should be asking feedback again on how am I going? Are you happy with the way things are going? Do we need to do it a little bit differently? So feedback needs to be two ways, and I think it's more effective when the student's involved in that process as well. So there's some of the strategies about more effective supervisors. A couple more points, and I've been doing this for around about 20 years, and I'm just going to describe, I suppose, some of the changes that I've seen over that time, and you'll be fairly familiar with these, but they have implications for students and supervisors. And the first one is just increasing numbers all the time. Every university I go to around the world, when you look at the strategic plan, they'll say, we're going to have more research students. And when I was in Ireland, a few years ago, they were going to double the number of research students. And that all sounds really wonderful. But there never was a piece in that plan that says, we're going to double the number of supervisors. So what that meant was, same number of supervisors seeing more students. And so that was going to cause a lot of problems, I think, for supervisors. And that puts a lot of pressure on to take students who aren't maybe in your area of expertise, or that you haven't got the time for those. And I think that's a little bit of a problem about increasing numbers without supporting supervisors along the way. A second and related problem, I think, is about diversity, because as we take in more students, that student population is now much more diverse. And diversity is a good thing, but it also creates some problems as well. That means you're now probably going to be talking with students who maybe haven't got a history of coming to university, maybe first in family to do a PhD or going through that process. People who have gone off and worked for a number of years and now are coming back later in life. Students from different backgrounds, cultural, social backgrounds. And it's great to have those, and we should have more, but it does create extra pressures on the system. How are supervisors going to support that? How are universities going to support those areas? The other one, the reality is, of course, why it makes it hard is because, of course, all the students are different. And so the thing that will work for one won't work for another, and so the demands on supervisors are much greater. The next thing that I've noticed across the world is much more emphasis on deadlines. And so we have to get our students through faster, we have to get more completions. So that's a good thing, really. But that puts a lot of pressure on the system, and so now we're having lots of forces to get things done at certain times. And the change I think that's led to is a lot more emphasis on milestones, on structured PhDs, cohort PhDs, a whole lot of different ways of trying to support students through that process. Which again, I'm in favour of. I think it's a really good thing to support people through that process. But it's a bit of a change from the model we would have had 20 or 30 years ago. And some supervisors haven't really got on board with the changes, but it's starting to, I've noticed. And the last one I think is about where students are going to go to, like this Irish sign. 20 or 30 years ago, the assumption was if you did a PhD, you were going to end up in academia. You were going to be lecturing or researching in academia. And of course that's completely changed now, and so many students who enter will never end up in academia or and so forth. And so that means that the model that applied 30 years ago isn't going to work now. And I suppose what I've seen there is the huge increase in emphasis on things like generic skills, transferable skills, ideas, things you can take past the PhD into other parts of your life. And again, I think that's a good thing. However, every university I go to is approaching it slightly differently. You see different models for doing this. I think as we try and work out what's the best way to do it. But the problem again I see is often this is another thing that's been passed back to the supervisor. Now, and they're thinking, as well as doing research, I now have to be a career guidance counselor, I have to do all these extra things as well. So I think the challenge is how do you do that in an effective way. So there's some of the changes. So the last little one I'm going to talk about, and then I'm happy to take questions, and this is my sort of pet topic, and this is the idea of toxic supervisors. Now, there's a whole range of supervisors. There'll be some wonderful supervisors. There's a big bunch in the middle who are doing the best they can, maybe not so great, but whatever. But up at the end of the tail, there's a small number of people I label toxic supervisors. And these aren't just bad supervisors. These are people who seem to deliberately go out of their way to make the student's life hard. And I'm sure if you think back to your institution, I'm sure you all know some of these people. And if you're a dean of a graduate school, you'll know them. You might not know them personally, but you'll know them by their students, because these are the students who come along either in bits or depressed or with mental health issues, or the whole world's falling apart. And that's bad enough for the university because it might affect your completion rates, but in my view, the bigger impact is the impact on the students. And I meet these students, and they're coming up to me after workshops, and it's a real dilemma. It's not just it's bad for the research, but their whole life has been messed up by this thing. And I meet students who are clinically depressed as a result of bad supervision. And that's not a small thing, that's a significant problem. And I reckon, people would say to me, but we have processes in place, they could complain, they can do other things. But what you have to remember is this thing called the power imbalance. Most students, and I work with them a lot, are very reluctant to put up their hand and complain about their supervisor because they know they're going to need that supervisor's sign on a reference later on, or they're going to meet. So most students will put up with really bad behaviour before they do something about it. And so I think that this is a challenge, I suppose. I reckon we have a duty of care to those students. If you know there's a supervisor at your university who has a track record of chewing up students and not getting through, or and then a new student comes along and says, oh, I'm going to go to the supervisor, I reckon there's a duty of care to say, no, that's not going to happen. Or we have safety nets in place to make sure it isn't going to happen. And this is often really difficult because these might be very eminent professors, or they have huge grant money, or they're really successful in some areas. But that doesn't mean you're a good supervisor. And so how do you do that? And again, there's no answer in what I'd like you to think about it, but some of the strategies I've seen that are useful, I think, is where you have supervisory panels. And lots of universities will have multiple supervisors, co-supervisors, and the benefit there is you might dilute the effect of this competent supervisor to somebody else. But in the US, they probably have more the idea of panels and teams of supervisors. And I think that's good because they have more networks, but also it means they have more sources to get resources. But I think probably at the end of the day, there almost has to be a blacklist, and that means you are not going to be allowed supervising. And this becomes a real acid test for the administration of the university. Are they willing to say, no, you are not going to do that? Because that has impacts for the professor's career, but so it should, because if they're messing up students' lives, then it's not appropriate that they carry on doing that. So what I'd like you to think about over the next couple of days is, what's happening in your institution? And are the toxic supervisors, what are the procedures for protecting those students in whatever way it might be? So in conclusion, and then the questions is, it is a roller coaster. And I don't think that will ever go well. I think there are going to be ups and downs. That's the nature of research. There's things go wrong. That's part of the process. However, there are things that students can do to make it easier for themselves, and you can support them in doing that. There are things that supervisors can do, and again, you can support them in doing that. There are. I suppose we have to respond to the various changes that are coming along, and also look at the idea of toxic supervisors. And I think there are going to be ups and downs, but I think if we do some of these things, it doesn't have to be such a scary ride for the students. So, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, we've got time for one or two quick questions. Okay, Jill.
Mine's a comment really about the last point.
I'll repeat. Yep.
I'll shout. Mine is a comment about Hugh's last point. I think that toxic supervisors can sometimes be managed by a strong head of school or department. And I've known it be managed through workload models because of the people who are eminent, bring in lots of money to university, and they're allowed to get on with that as long as they do it. And the student stuff is taken away. And I think that can work, and then nobody sort of has to really fail.
Yeah. So the point there, I suppose, is that a good head of school, or that there are ways to manage this, and it's confrontation with the reality as well. And so there are ways to manage that. But I think what I would want is that somebody's looking after the student's interest as well. So, because often they feel completely abandoned, and people say, well, and so they don't have the confidence to do it, because by that stage, by the time it's got to the point of complaining, their confidence is completely gone. And they're thinking, I can't even do this. And what happens is they internalise it must be me. It's not this, I must be doing something wrong. So I think it's a combination of both. Yeah.
We've only got a couple of minutes for a changeover, so I'm going to have to draw questions to Paul. Hugh's going to be around for a couple of days, so there's plenty of time to network. Thank you very much, Hugh, for a very entertaining insight into this PhD journey and the relationships between supervisors and students.